Hello, everybody. This is your Wednesday, April 22nd devotional. Hope you're all doing well as you're socially isolated and staying distance from each other. Today, I have a special edition of the Wednesday devotional. Joining me today is Randy Chandrosky, and we're going to consider together his testimony, how he came to know and trust in Jesus. So most of you all know Randy and know him well, but perhaps some of you don't know him as well. So I just want to give a brief little introduction before we dive into his conversion story. So Randy's an elder at Fort William. He's been in a leadership role for some 30 years. He's married to Janine. He has two children, Kyle and Randy Lynn, and he has three grandchildren. Randy is retired from Hydro, and I'm sure he's very happy about that. I just got a thumbs up. And though he's retired, he's working hard. He's pursuing an MDiv from Reformed Theological Seminary, and he's about halfway through that program. And he's been working away. Last year, he was an intern at the church working on the Constitution, and we're currently, as an elder board, pushing through all of the work that he did. So very thankful for Randy's careful work on the Constitution. So welcome, Randy.
Good morning.
Awesome. Well, our format doesn't allow for a lot of time, so we're just going to get right down into business together. So Randy, thinking about your conversion story, first question I want to ask, what was your religious upbringing like? Thinking about your contact with the church, your attitude towards Christianity before you became a Christian.
Okay. First of all, good morning, church family. And I've been thinking about you and praying for you, miss worshiping with you and fellowshipping with you together, and long for the day when we can get back together and do that. Yeah, so my time before I came to Christ, it's probably best to kind of break my younger years up into two sections between the time I was up to 15 and then between 15 and 23. But I would say there's a common thread between that whole time that I kind of felt like I was in a cloud, always walking in a cloud, and life really didn't make sense to me. So that would be a common theme. But up to the time I was 15, so I grew up in Winnipeg. I was born in 1963. My parents were Roman Catholic, and we attended church regularly. I was confirmed in the Roman Catholic Church. I remember snippets of studying for my confirmation, and there was nothing really substantial there. I did know that God existed. My parents they did instruct me on some things, spiritual things like praying before I went to bed, but we never really did talk about religion. And I would say that my parents were nominally Roman Catholic, but definitely not Christians. And I would say that probably the most, some of the significant memories that I have about God as a child were using him as a lifeline, getting myself into trouble and then praying, saying, God, if you get me out of this, I'll never do it again. And but I would say all in all, as a child, I was an obedient child. I never did, get angry at my parents. Things around when I was 15 years old, things did change and I became rebellious. But I was an obedient child, but a lot of that had to do with, stemmed out of fear. My father was harsh with me. Our home life was very dysfunctional. My parents fought quite often, and there was a lot of strife and anger. And my father had there was a lot of emotional abuse towards me and physical abuse. And so my obedience wasn't, because I feared God or I loved God. It was more that I feared the wrath of my parents. And so around the age of 15, we moved to Thunder Bay. I grew up in Winnipeg, as I said. I moved to Thunder Bay, and there were numerous factors that all kind of bled together, and I became a rebellious child. And then when I say rebellious, I started doing all the things that my parents said, not to do. And so God was not in my thoughts at that time. But the guilt of sin, was ever present with me. And so at one point during my teenage years, I had done two things that were serious. And my dad had this meeting with me in the kitchen and said, those were 2 strikes, and 3 strikes, you're out. And so after this discussion, he barred me from seeing all my, my friends that I had made in high school in Thunder Bay. And he basically said to me, go out and find a girlfriend. So that's when Janine entered the picture. At the high school we went to, Fort William Collegiate Institute, across the street there were 2 apartment buildings, and there's this alcove in there where a number of us would go hide out to have a smoke, have a cigarette. And it also happened to be Janine's shortcut to school, and so that's where we met. I had a plaid red bush jacket on, having a smoke, and that's where I met Janine. So it was a typical Thunder Bay romance, love at first sight. But 2 years later, we were married, and Kyle was born. Janine had grown up in Thunder Bay, and her home church was Fort William Baptist Church. So after Kyle was born, she started attending church again. And I was not attending church. I had graduated from high school, and I was taking mechanical engineering at Lakehead University during that time. And then right around that time, my parents moved. My dad got a job at head office in Toronto with the CIBC. They moved away. And that was kind of the stepping up of my rebelliousness. I felt that my parents, their presence was gone. These restrictions that they had imposed upon my life were suddenly gone, and that led to vices in the excess, and it all came to kind of a miserable head when Janine left me, and she took our son Kyle. She went to live at her parents, and so that was 1986. I was 23, and that was a low point in my life. That was the first time I really was ever alone, and found myself, as I said, at the low point of my life. So I would say that was the time that I was, just before God started to intervene in my life.
So in your pre-conversion stage, if you had to articulate the gospel, what kind of articulation would you have given to it, especially growing up nominally Roman Catholic?
I would say that I didn't know the gospel. I would say that Christianity was more like moral rules. My dad had a couple, his thing was, don't talk about religion or politics. And all of my church experiences, even with my grandparents, I was an altar boy at the Ukrainian Catholic Church. And it was more a sense of tradition, a sense of custom. My dad said he enjoyed going to church because it made him feel good. So we never really did talk about religion, and the gospel was virtually unknown to me. My thought about God was more in terms of evolution versus creationism, that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. Thinking about the gospel and then the character of God. How did you conceive of God at this point?
Yeah, I would say that as a younger child, I would say that I did think that God created the world in one sense, but it was very confusing. As I said, I was kind of living in a cloud, and all of this just wasn't clear to me. So I would, and then when in my teenage years, I would say that I just pushed God to the periphery, and he was completely out of my thoughts. So I would say that I did not grow up in a Christian home. I did not grow up in an evangelistic atmosphere, and so this was all it was all new to me when I became a Christian.
Hmm. So moving along in your story, you've got this point of crisis with your marriage. Thinking about God's providence, what means did the Lord use in your life to begin drawing you to Himself?
Yeah, I'm going to expand on it a bit, but it was really this crisis moment. I had, the fact that Janine left me was a wake-up call. And in her mind, she had always said that she was going to leave. And she had left, and then she phoned me and said, this is over. I'm serious. We're done. And, I guess, God had a different plan. So we've been married 37 years. But as I said, it was the first time in my life I found myself alone. So I didn't have any relatives in Thunder Bay. My friends, they weren't good friends. And so they really never came to my rescue during this time. And I really felt like it was kind of like God unraveled my life. And I was at this point where I was just sitting there thinking about it. And so the question, I think, that just kept haunting me was why? Some basic questions of life. Why did I exist? What am I doing? Who am I? Those kind of basic questions. And they really did consume me. They were haunting me. And when we were first married, my sister had asked Janine, what can I get you for a wedding gift? And Janine thought maybe, just a family Bible. So when we were initially married, when we got married, my sister bought this NIV study Bible for us, and it had been sitting in our living room, and I'd never ever looked at it. But one day I came home from work, and these questions were, kind of persistently bothering me, and I picked up this Bible. I thought I'd read it, and so, of course, I wasn't familiar with the Bible, and it's a book. So, what do? Well, you start at the beginning. I picked up the Bible and opened it up, and I started reading Genesis, and it was really like a light bulb came on for me. It was probably the first time in my life that I had some clarity. And I would say that, thinking back through it now, having a clear doctrine of Scripture, that, the Bible is the only place that we could find the divine words of God. We don't find them anywhere else. He's spoken there, and I believe that He spoke to me. And when I finished reading that night, I closed the book back up, and the very first thought to me that came to me is that I got to go to church. And of course, I didn't really know anything about the church at all, but I would say, so I would say that is the means that God used. It was this crisis moment, and then, supernaturally, divinely, providentially leading me to His Word.
Did you start reading in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1?
Yeah.
And how far did you make it?
It captured my attention, so I was reading it for quite some time before I put it down. But it all of a sudden started to make sense. And I would say that these questions were haunting me. Like, why do I exist? Everything that I'd known up to that point, I was doing either because my friends told me, my dad told me, what I learned in school, as when parents have children and then they're 3 years old, and they keep asking why, and then they go to grade school, and they're driving their parents nuts, but they go to grade school, high school, and university, and they forget to ask why. And all of a sudden, the basic questions of life opened up to me, and Genesis really answered those questions for me.
Mm.
So it captivated me. I can't remember exactly how long or where I read to, but I can't remember.
Mm.
But yeah, it did have a, yeah. Sorry.
The converting power of Genesis.
There you go. Yeah.
So you get some questions answered in Genesis, and then you need to go to church, and so you decide to go to Fort William, right?
Yeah. So during that whole time, there was, like I said, my friends were not really friends, and there was probably a handful of Christians that reached out to me at that time. I had started playing the guitar when I was in high school, and there was a Christian guy I used to go and jam with. He happened to be a guitar instructor, and then there was several other people. One guy I went to high school with, he had become a Christian, so he'd reached out to me. So already God was, intervening in my life. I felt compelled to go to church, and the only place I really had gone to church was a Roman Catholic church in Thunder Bay, and I didn't feel compelled at all to go there. And the only other church that I knew about was Fort William Baptist Church. And, I did find out later that people like Shirley Southall had been praying for me. And so that, this was, things that I found out later, how God was answering prayers. But, yeah, so I had made up in my mind, like it's interesting to reflect back on these things, but I had made up my mind that I needed to go to church. And like I said, the only place I knew to go was Fort William, but I knew that Janine was going there and her mom was going there. And I had said in my heart before God that, I'm not going there, and he knew this, and, God knows your heart. And I'm not going there to win back Janine. I'm going there to encounter God. And so I began attending there. And, I remember the first Sunday that I showed up, and Janine and her mom were there, and it's like, what are you doing here? And anyways, I began sitting under the preaching of the word, and one thing led to another. And Janine had saw, a heartfelt change in me. And during that time, she ended up moving back home. And so we began attending church regularly, including Sunday school. And God was kind of using all of these things to introduce me to the gospel. Jerry and Ann Williams invited us to a Christian businessman's meeting where a lawyer gave us testimony. It was a powerful testimony, and that was one thing among all the other things that kind of bled together for the gospel to make sense to me. And shortly after that, I went and talked to Howard Hancock's father, Jack Hancock, and said, I want to be baptized. I want to be part of the church, member of the church. And so God really did use the church as an instrument in my conversion. Yeah.
So we've got the broad overview, and so kind of looking more to the interior, thinking about what was actually going on inside of you. As you were reading Genesis, opening up the scriptures, as you're sitting under God's word, preached, as you were having these conversations with different folks in the church, what aspects of the gospel, what aspects of God's character really grabbed hold of you, comforted you, convicted you, encouraged you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say, again, I'm going back 33 years. So I'd say probably the two things that stood out. There was more, of course, but God is a purposeful creator, and that was my encounter with Genesis, with him in Genesis. When I read that, I understood that he created me for a purpose, and I really felt like, yeah, I get it. And I would probably say the second thing would be that God is a forgiving God.
Mm.
Um, I mean, I really truly felt forgiven. I mean, I still do. I had mounted up all of these sins. I'd heaped them all up, and I knew that God forgave me, and because of Christ, and He's not going to hold these things against me. Some people's testimony, which is just, I mean, I wish I didn't have to go through these things, but I did. But my testimony is, there's a season in my life where, and this all didn't happen overnight, but it was over a period of time, where there's a lot of shedding of sin and putting on the righteousness of Christ. And so there was a definite period in my life where I needed the forgiveness of God. And I would say probably, the thing that, arrested my heart was the forgiveness of God. I felt like I do have a new life. And I kind of felt like it's a new day. It's a new moment in my life. I've got a new life. So those things are very distinct for me. Just enjoying the forgiveness of God and thankful for that.
So you go from a very cloudy way of understanding God, and then you hear the gospel and you get a very clear picture of who God is: grace and mercy, forgiveness of sins. I think that's everybody's story of conversion as well. Thinking about your time as you started coming to Fort William, what were some significant discipling relationships, some significant men who came into your life, and in what ways did they prod you along?
Yeah. Like I said, my upbringing with my parents, I mean, I love my parents, and my dad was harsh on me, but I became a Christian. And he died a year after I became a Christian, and we reconciled, and I don't have anything against my dad. And my dad did teach me a lot of things. My grandfather taught me a lot of things. Some of my upbringing, those were two influential men, but they were not Christian men. Coming into the church, I've heard this many times over the years, that what you do as a Christian, you come into the church and you get reparented. And I really like that statement, because all of a sudden I found myself having, 10 sets of parents. I had new mothers and new fathers. And I would say that was significant for me. So I had Dave and Jerry in my life. And Dave was a great example to me of what a Christian man. I would say, like I said, a lot of times you think, oh, I got one mother and I want to keep it that way, but I ended up having like 5 or 6 mothers. But it was great. I had Eleanor Trindiak, Ann Williams, and many other women that came into my life that were influential, even like Faith. In terms of discipling, we did initially go to Sunday school, as I said, but this was kind of just before Kevin came, and I would say that, and Bill. So I would say those 2 men for sure have been the most influential in my life in terms of discipling me. Kevin, we started going to Kevin's Bible study when he came, and he mentored me, and we eventually transitioned to having our own Bible study. And so I would prepare my lessons, and then Kevin would come pick me up at Thunder Bay Hydro, and we'd meet for an hour, and I had 20 questions that I had to ask to work through that lesson, and that happened for years. So that was kind of in my early days in terms of discipling. And there was, of course, I just felt like I was green, and there was just a flood of information everywhere coming in about who God was, what the Bible was, how to live a Christian life, those kind of things. So I'm very thankful for that part of my life. Yeah. So like I said, you come into the church and there's all kinds of people around you, caring for you, loving you, praying for you, influencing you. Yeah.
The Lord is indeed kind, and the church,
Mm-hmm.
and God's grace is evident in the church as He reparents us, because we all need the reparenting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you, Randy, for opening up a bit to us and sharing God's grace in your life. I hope you're encouraged as you listen to Randy, and I hope you're led to worship God, because I'm reminded of Peter's words in 1 Peter, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. We have evidence, we just heard evidence of God's grace, and we should respond by blessing God and worshiping Him. So blessings to you on this day, and may you be encouraged and edified